The texts that we have today are familiar ones, and they tie together in a better fashion than they do some weeks. The first reading, though, is a bit truncated. All of the readings that we have, obviously, are not the whole Bible. There is a beginning and an end, and there's stuff that comes before and after that is not included. And sometimes as I take a look at the readings and begin to look into them for the coming Sunday, I always find it kind of interesting what gets left out at the front or the back, or sometimes even right straight clipped out of the middle of it that we're not reading in worship. In today's first reading, we hear about Abram and Sarai, who become Abraham and Sarah. We hear about God approaching them. This is well before the time of Moses and the law of Moses, which is an interesting part that we get to in the second reading, that God reckoned Abram and Sarai as righteous, not because their ability to follow the law of Moses, which didn't exist, but because of their faith. Their faith. Now that brings us to what's missing in this text. God approaches Abraham and has this grand covenant with him. You will be the ancestors of many nations. And this is to a very old man and a very old woman who have no children. So what we miss in this is the verses that follow, where they laugh at the plan. They laugh at the plan. Now, I don't know if that's part of the faith reckoned to them as righteousness. They continued to walk in that path. But there is something about what God is saying that God is going to do in their lives that seems laughably impossible. Doesn't that sometimes happen in our own lives? The things that we sense that God is calling us to be about as a congregation or as individuals sometimes seems almost laughably outlandish compared to where we currently are. What you're talking about, God, is impossible. Is impossible. Impossible? What is impossible with God? What is impossible? When we take a look at the readings, you can imagine when we get to the gospel text that Peter is being caught up in the impossible. There is a strong, powerful sense that he is starting to get ahead of the story, a sense of some grand vision about what could be, something that could be a scenario where maybe he becomes kind of big in the whole scheme of history. If he just stays close enough to Jesus, they're marching on their way to Jerusalem. There is all kinds of potential for this revolution to bring in a new era where Peter has a nice office and job and people who help him do stuff. He's getting ahead of the story. He's getting ahead of Jesus. I was mindful as I was thinking about this business of getting ahead of things. When I was in kindergarten, I don't have a particular memory of this, but it certainly sounds accurate, and my mom enjoys bringing it up periodically. There was a report card that went home in regards to Matt Smuts and how he was doing in kindergarten. And one of the notes at the bottom that the teacher had written was that Matt would do better if he waited to listen to all the instructions before beginning his work. Wise words. Wise words. Something that I think perhaps I'm not alone in, but we get two pieces of information and leap ahead to what's coming. That's Peter. Peter is 6 steps ahead. Now, to be clear, it is hard to follow from the front, right? It's hard to follow from the front. I remember when I was in college, I was a presidential host. which meant that when students were visiting the campus with their families, I had been trained to give tours of the campus and show them around and share a little bit of the university's story. And so there I was walking all around Cal Lutheran's campus backwards, because that's how you do that, right? You walk backwards the whole way. It's awkward. It's awkward to lead that way when the people who really should be in the front are the ones who are visiting. As people of faith, Jesus is the one who should be in the front. But like Peter, we're not always comfortable with where he's leading us, because he doesn't always take the scenic route. He doesn't always take the short and flat route that's easy and not too strenuous. He doesn't always take the route that's comfortable or goes by the places we'd like to go. But rather, he tends to go the long way, where there's maybe not a lot to see, and in through neighborhoods that we wouldn't normally go to, and among people that we would often walk wide around. Now, Peter, curiously, doesn't like this idea. Perhaps he's got another vision. He's seen ahead and sees the potential for what Jesus could really be about. And in Mark's account of this, we get a curious amount of detail for Mark, who is kind of the Cliff Notes version of the gospel. Everything is very tight. There are not a lot of extraneous words. And suddenly we get a lot of physical detail that's not strictly necessary for the narrative, but I feel is very telling. Jesus is speaking to his followers there, and it says that Peter takes him aside. Now, in case you were wondering, it's not the student's job or prerogative to take the teacher aside. That's not how it works. Peter has gotten ahead of himself. He's gotten way ahead of himself. And he pulls Jesus aside and says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's not get too crazy on this death and pain and hard road ahead. We've run that through marketing and it just doesn't sell. We need to talk more about joy and good living and how you will be blessed materially. What happens next is another physical reference. Jesus turns, perhaps we might say, away from Peter towards the disciples and rebukes Peter, the text suggests, publicly. And not just like, hey, Peter, that's not cool. This isn't your place. This isn't the way I'm going. You need to follow. Get behind me, Satan. That's not some subtle rebuke. That's a firm stop. Peter is returned to his place. Now, there are parts of the story that aren't written into the book in the same linear fashion that I think are important. Because in most of the stories, in most of the movies that we might watch, Peter then would be shunned out of the group, and maybe he becomes one of the bad guys, right? That's how Hollywood would make it. But that's not what happens. Peter stays with the group, and in fact, at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, receives probably some of the most graceful and gospel-oriented words in all of the Gospels. When the angel at the tomb tells the women, "Go and tell the disciples and Peter. Make sure you tell Peter. If he is not there, find him." And Peter. And Peter. Always included, in spite of his wanting to follow from the front. The last piece I want to leave with you is the part about the cross in this story. The cross is part of our current vernacular, has always been a part of who we are as Christians. I have one around my neck. We have one in the front of our church. Many of us wear it as jewelry. You can see it on signs outside or on top of the steeple. This image of the cross. But after so many centuries, in many ways it has lost its horror, its shame, its brutalness. There are all kinds of ways in which we have lost our ability to be stunned by its brutality. And Jesus talks about it as the place he must go in his journey. Now, we've played that down. We've made the crosses plain. We've made them pretty. And sometimes we don't always appreciate what they stand for. Or even in our current way of speaking, we might say, well, that's my cross to bear. Usually it means something like you're the one that has to handwrite the invitations for a party, or something like that. Usually not something to the scale of cross, and not at all what Jesus is talking about in the text. If we follow Jesus, not from the front, not with our own ideas as to where he should be going, not without reading all of the instructions and taking all of the gospel, but taking two pieces and running with them. If we hear Jesus' words and follow, we are talking about the sacrifices that we are called to make because we follow him and because we share his gospel in this world. In the text today, it's very clear. If we are seeking to be cool, if we are seeking to be the forerunners of our culture, following the cross is not the way to get us there. But it is nonetheless what we are called to be about. During this week in Lent, as you think about what it means to journey towards the cross on Good Friday, what it means to arrive to the good news on Easter Sunday, be mindful that we are called to follow from behind, to follow all of Jesus' teachings, not just the 2 or 3 that we like, to go where he goes, and to recognize that the closer we are to him, we will likely be in unexpected places that maybe are not easy or safe or comfortable, but are in the presence and peace of Christ. And that is a life worth living. Amen.